Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another fantastic episode of the Grammar Police Live. I hope you're all doing very well, swimmingly, I presume. Although maybe some of you are feeling a little bit anxious because today we're going to talk about the conditionals. So, as you can see, the menu in front of us today, we have the zero conditional, the first conditional, the second conditional, and the third conditional. Now, on top of that, we are also going to be talking about the mixed conditional, and there are two types of the mixed conditional that we are going to discuss today. So, as always, the rules are simple. If you have any questions at all, any doubts, anything that you want to say to me, please tell me. Leave a message in the chat. I don't know. Um, leave a comment if it's a recording as well. Doesn't bother me at all. However, medium you decide to communicate to me in, I don't mind at all. Um, we are here to help you, and we want to make sure that you have a positive exam experience. Now, actually, before we start, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of exams because it's this time of year, you know? It's March. Some of you are actually doing exams this month, and some of you are preparing for exams in June. So I wanted to give just a little bit of advice before we get started today. If you have exams in 3 months, which a lot of my students do, I would really take advantage of this month to make sure that all of your materials are in tip top shape, all of your notes are in order, so that, when the time comes and you start to study in June, that you can read your own handwriting, all of these different things. And I would also take a little look, if you've got time, at the very first live session that we did here at the Grammar Police about IELTS B2, the first exam, the Cambridge Advanced, the C1. I'm pretty sure we even talked about the language cert exam at one point. So, at the very beginning of that live session, we talked about some key materials that you could use to practice. And I would really like for you all to do as best as physically possible. So, my recommendation would be to head on over there, have a look at the list of resources, and get practicing, right? Or at least save it for June, right? That would be my advice to you all. So, without further ado, I suppose we should get started. Now, I chose the topic of the conditionals today because the conditionals suck. Nobody likes to learn about the conditionals. In fact, I did a little survey before we got started today to see how people were feeling about the conditionals. Yes, granted, we only had 2 votes, but those 2 votes told me very much about people's level of conditional knowledge. In the sense that they didn't know very much at all. So for me, this seems like a perfect opportunity to jump on the conditionals wagon, and hopefully by the end of this class, we'll all be feeling super fresh and super fantastic about the conditionals. So I think we should get started. What we're going to talk about today is form. We're also going to talk about meaning, and we might even have to talk about pronunciation at some points, especially when we're talking about the mixed conditionals there. Okay. But most importantly, we might see some exceptions and funky rules that I would like to talk to you all about today. Okay, so let's get into it. Our zero conditional is our very first conditional, which is really, really, really easy. We start with the if statement, which, by the way, this is one of our key words. Right, a conditional if. You can't really have a conditional if you don't have this word. There is another word that satisfies, but if is the best one. If with the present simple tense, followed by, so if I put a comma and then a plus sign, you know that it's the second part of the conditional, followed by the present simple tense again. Let's have a look at an example. or even easier, people say this in a slightly different way. If you heat water, it boils. Sorry, I'm still thinking about the passive voice from the last class. Forgive me, forgive me. Which, by the way, if you want to go and have a look at the passive voice session, I would totally recommend doing so. It's a really, really intense hour where we talk about all of the different forms of the passive voice and also some strange rules and weird word orders, okay? And the purpose of the passive voice as well. So, this is the zero conditional. If you heat water, it boils. This is like a textbook example, It's something that is like a fact of life, something that always happens. You can guarantee that if you're using the zero conditional, it's something that is certain. So you have to ask yourself the question, do you need to use if the word if is a condition? Not necessarily. You could also use the word when. When you heat water, it boils. Your The indication that you are giving when you say something like that is that it happens every single time. Okay? When you heat water, every time you heat water, it boils. Now, okay, like I said, this is a textbook definition of the zero conditional. But let's see if we can try to apply the zero conditional to our everyday lives. Can you think of something that happens to you every single time you fulfill a certain condition? I know that I do. If I drink coffee in the afternoon, I can't sleep at night. This is something that happens to me every single time I drink coffee in the afternoon. So, for that reason, the zero conditional is used to demonstrate a fact of life that is 100% certain. Okay? It's a fact, it happens every time. Okay. The reason that I'm giving this very distinct sort of emphasis on the fact that it happens every time is because a lot of my students confuse the zero conditional with the first conditional, which is something that we're going to look at right now. The first conditional is also a pretty nice conditional. It's kind of easy to remember. You start with if, of course, and you take the present simple again. Okay. And then you follow it up with the future. Now, normally you're going to see will, okay? You can use other things like might to show possibility. That is definitely something that you can do. However, normally people use it with will. So let's see if we can apply that same example to this first conditional. So we start with the same, with the present simple, same as before. And then instead of saying, I can't sleep at night, we say, I won't sleep tonight. Now, ask yourself this question. Does it happen every time? No, because I'm talking specifically about tonight. So if I'm very specific, then yes, the first conditional definitely does say something that is likely, but we're talking about a specific time. We're not saying that it happens every single time, like we were saying before. Okay? If I drink coffee in the afternoon, I won't sleep tonight. But if I say, if I drink coffee in the afternoon, I can't sleep at night, then that means that it happens all the time. Okay? There is a very distinct difference there. But let's see if we can think of some more examples. Don't forget that when it comes to conditionals, you can also use them to ask questions. So, for example, if it rains today, will you come with me to the cinema? This operates under the condition that if it doesn't rain, the option of going to the cinema doesn't exist, right? But this person is implying to us that if it rains, they will go to the cinema, and that's why they are asking us. Okay? Equally, we can also use this to talk about other things that are likely. So, if you can think of anything in your life that is possible if a certain condition is fulfilled, then it will probably work in the first conditional. Let's see if I can think of another example. If I cook tonight, the food will be terrible. Now, you can imagine that maybe the conditions that create this scenario are because I'm really tired or because I can't be bothered to cook. So I'm saying if with the present tense, if I cook tonight, the food will be terrible. It's very likely that this is the case. Okay? Now, I'm going to stop talking about the zero conditional and I'm going to stop talking about the first conditional. I'm under the impression that the majority of my students understand these two conditionals pretty well. But what often happens is that when we introduce the second conditional and the third conditional, things become a little bit crazy. And that's why I want to talk to you about this today, because I want to make it crystal clear the difference between each of these conditionals. One trick that I think is really, really helpful, I'm going to include this at the top here. If, in the case of conditionals, never, ever, ever goes with would. Now, why am I saying that? I'm saying it because I have a lot of students who say things like, if I would be rich, I would have a horse. If does not go with would. That is to say that the conditional part of the conditional structure doesn't go with the word if. Okay? Normally, there is another tense that fits better with the if statement. You have to remember that the whole point of conditionals is to talk about hypothetical, imaginary, sometimes situations. So if we are talking about a condition and we're talking about the possibilities or results of that condition, then that's going to come in the second part of the sentence. It's certainly not going to come when we're talking about the condition itself. So whenever you have a student who is saying something like, if I would have been in space, I would have done, you can put a hand on their shoulder and say, hey, no, that doesn't make sense because would and if are not good friends. They do not mix. Okay? With that said, let's have a look at the second conditional, shall we? Now, this will be really, really good fun. For me, probably not for you. So, like I said, the word if does not go with the word would at any point. We start with the past simple. Okay? Then we go on to use the conditional tense. Would with a verb. Okay? Let's have a look at some examples to make that really, really clear. Okay? If I had a lot of money, I would buy a block of flats. If I had a lot of money, that is probably what I would do. But something that's interesting about the conditional is that we don't have to say it all together in one, starting with if every single time. We can also swap it around slightly. So we might start by saying something like this. What would you do if you were abducted by aliens? I mentioned this briefly in the last class. Sometimes when you're an English teacher, it requires a certain amount of creativity to come up with examples. And that's not something that I'm always very good at. But this is a situation that I've definitely spoken about with my friends in the past, right? Or like, what would you say if you found out that your best friend was pregnant? This is a longer one where we have the result, what would you say in the conditional, but then we have if you found out in the past simple, And we have best friend was pregnant, which is also in the past simple. This is because when you use a conditional, even if you have two past simple verbs with the if condition, that's absolutely fine. It wouldn't suddenly become the present simple tense just because you have already used the past simple tense once before. Okay? So these are all great examples of the second conditional. But I think that something that a lot of my students say that makes things a little bit confusing is what it means to be a second conditional. So, for me personally, I would say that the second conditional is used for imaginary situations, really crazy situations. They are unlikely. For example, what would you do if you were abducted by aliens? This is incredibly unlikely, right? But at the same time, just because it's unlikely doesn't mean, or just because it's a crazy situation, I should say, doesn't mean that it's completely and utterly impossible. When we use the second conditional, we're talking about the future. And so, if we are talking about the future, then that means that anything could happen. The future is far in the distance. We don't really know what could possibly happen, and so we use the second conditional. Some people think that when a situation is really, really crazy, that it's necessary to use the third conditional, but really that's not true. The third conditional only is used to describe rather impossible situations, not because it's a crazy scenario, but because it's too late. You can't go back in time to fulfill that condition. And for that reason, the third conditional is used for impossibilities, not from how crazy the situation is, but because it is too late to go back in time. Well, going back in time is perceived as impossible in this grammar topic. So, if something is too late, then you're probably going to use the third conditional. Okay? So, going back to the second conditional, though, there is something interesting that I want to talk about here, and that is the if statement with the verb to be. It's a little bit irregular and it's strange in English because some Latin languages have something called the subjunctive, where the rules of the language change just because the mood and the way that you're speaking is changing as well. But actually, this is probably one of the only situations where this specific type of grammar sort of manifests itself. There are a few more examples, but this is a pretty big one. So you can say in English, if I was rich, I would buy a car. Classic example, right? If I was rich, I would buy a car. Equally, you could say, if I were rich, I would buy a car. Now, which one do you think sounds right, guys? Which one sounds like the normal option? In accordance with the English subjunctive, if I were rich is technically more correct in this case. So if you're using a second conditional structure and you have to use the conjugation of to be, it's actually better and it sounds more natural to use if I were. I'd like you all to hearken back to Beyonce's song, If I Were a Boy, right? She says, if I were, and then she starts talking about all of the things that she would do if she were a boy. Equally, something that's very important here is that it can be I, it could be he, she, it. We were, they were, you were. We know that already. That much is obvious, right? But when it comes to specifically I and he, she, and it, normally it's was. But in this particular case, it's were for the second conditional. Fascinating. Hi, Aaron Yeager. No, you can't. That's curious. Let's move on. Okay, so the second conditional is very, very useful in terms of talking about imaginary situations. So Ultimately, if you are speaking in hypotheticals, talking about possibilities in the future, you can use lots of different modal verbs like could or would or possibilities or all of these different things, or might or may. But you can also use the second conditional to describe those hypotheticals. So you could say, for example, I might go to the cinema, but at the same time, you could also say something like, if I had the chance, I would go to the cinema. And that makes you sound really cool, especially if you are the kind of person who is doing an English exam and you want to show your variety and accuracy. Okay? So let's talk about the third conditional, shall we? That will be good fun. Now, okay, the third conditional is definitely a toughie, because when it comes to the second conditional, I think it's pretty within reason. If you can remember the past simple, you can remember the would that comes afterwards. In this case, with the third conditional, it's definitely a lot more complicated. So we have to put a bit more attention into the third conditional. Okay, so let's see. If with the past perfect, then with the conditional perfect. Now you might be looking at that and thinking, Emily, I don't know what the past perfect or what the conditional perfect mean. So let's go into a bit more detail. Now, the present perfect goes with have and a past participle. The third conditional is the past perfect. So it's had and the past participle. Like, I had taken, I don't know, a shoe from the shop. I had stolen a shoe from the shop. I had written inappropriate things in an English teacher's chat box for a live stream, for instance. Okay? Following that, we need the future, the conditional perfect, which is would have with a past participle. Okay? So, would have is normally used on its own to maybe show another potential option, but it doesn't really sound very good on its own, and it sounds much, much better in the third conditional. So let's have a look at some examples. Okay. If I had been born in the USA, I would have learned how to use a gun. Okay, that might be a little bit on the nose, but it's a good example. Okay. What we're saying is that the act of being born in the USA, like, I don't know about you guys, I was born in Britain. Is it possible for me to be born in the United States right now? No. I've already been born once. I don't get another chance, unfortunately, right? So, for that reason, it's too late. We talked about impossibilities earlier. The third conditional is used to describe situations that are completely impossible. And this is an example of one of those. Okay? If I had been born in the USA, and then the second part, I would have learned how to use a gun. Well, that's just because it's possible in the US to learn how to use a gun. And if I had that opportunity presented to me, or if I had had that opportunity, now it's too late, I would have taken it. Okay? So I think it's very, very important to take advantage of the fact that we're talking about something that is too late. It's always talking about something that is too late. Okay? Let's have a look at the second example. If I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. This is a really, really good example, in my opinion, because you can think about what happens in the context of this particular situation. So, for example, has the exam happened? Yes. What happened in the exam? I failed it. Oops, right? Did I study hard at the time? No, unfortunately, I did not. Okay. So if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. Something that I always tell my students when it comes to the third conditional is that you can actually replace the third conditional with another modal verb, and it normally works. So if you are thinking about a different way of expressing your regret about something that is too late, then you can also use should have with a past participle. Okay? For example, I should have been more respectful in the chat. That's a regret, isn't it? Let's see if we can use the third conditional to rephrase that regret. If I had been more respectful in the chat, maybe Emily would have appreciated my existence. As you can see, because it was too late for that person to be respectful, the act of appreciating this person has passed, right? This is a good example of showing regret, okay? So, equally, if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. What could we say then? What should we have done? We should have studied harder, right? If we should have studied harder, then that means that we can use the third conditional to express what the results would have been if we had studied harder. It's a good way to think about what you actually want to say using the third conditional. I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to learning these conditionals is that students find it very difficult to think of examples. And that's what I would like to call upon talking to you guys. What regrets do you have? Right? You could say something like, I should have gotten that job. I should have gotten that job. I don't know why I didn't get that job. If I had gotten that job, what would have happened? I would have celebrated with my family. I would have received a better salary, right? Things like this. Okay. We also saw another example. If you had gotten into Oxford University, what job would you have gotten? Goodness, I'm using this word gotten quite a lot, aren't I? I mean, it's a great word. This is another future live stream event that we're going to do at the Grammar Police about the word get. Just to give you a little bit of a spoiler, the word get has, according to the Oxford Dictionary, 289 different meanings. So it's definitely no joke of a word. But it's interesting when you realize how much you use a word, it's pretty crazy. So, if you had gotten into Oxford University, what job would you have gotten? And I'm imagining in this situation that the person did not get into Oxford University. They might be showing a little bit of regret about that. So they might be thinking, I should have gotten into Oxford University, or I should have tried harder to get into Oxford University. Fun fact, I actually tried to get into Oxford University and didn't get in the end because of my grades. I should have gotten in, but I didn't. But if I had, right now, I would probably be president. I'm just kidding. But did you hear what I said then? If I had gotten into university, right now, I would be president. That leads us on rather seamlessly into our next topic today, which is the mixed conditional. So I want to talk to you about that, and that's going to be really fun. I promise nobody's going to cry about it. So we've talked about all of the different conditionals. We're going to do a little bit of a quiz at the end if we've got time. And yes, those conditionals are great. They are lots of fun. I'm sure that you've had a wonderful time so far. I can see some of you in the chat are having the time of your lives. So that's really cool. But now we're going to talk about the mixed conditional. So whatever fun you were having before, you're not going to have any fun anymore. Okay? So let's get started. Based on your previous knowledge with the second conditional and the third conditional, hopefully we'll be able to add a little bit more context to these mixed conditionals here. So we have two types. One that starts with the second conditional and then is followed by the third, and then one that starts with the third conditional that is followed by the second. For me personally, there is certainly one that is easier to use, but in my experience as a teacher, this depends quite heavily on which student you are. Like a lot of my students prefer this one, but a lot of my students would also say that that's really stupid and that they prefer this one. So it really is just a matter of what you would be more likely to use, but they both have completely different meanings. So let's start with the first one, shall we? If I weren't so stupid, I wouldn't have made you cry. That's a really good example of a mixed conditional that is starting with the second and then finishing with the third. I want you to think about what this sentence means. If I weren't so stupid, I wouldn't have made you cry. Is this person stupid all the time? That's actually what this sentence is implying. Because if this sentence was just the third conditional, if I hadn't been so stupid, I wouldn't have made you cry. Is it possible to just be stupid in a moment? Some people would say that, yeah, it is possible to just be briefly stupid and have a lapse of stupidity or make a stupid decision. And yes, I would agree with that actually. So you could use the third, conditional for that. Let's try with the second conditional. If I weren't so stupid, I wouldn't make you cry. Why do you make me cry all the time? Like, you are so stupid that you are constantly making me cry. I don't know about that. I feel like this particular situation indicates that a present characteristic or something that is happening pretty frequently in the present is causing or has caused an event in the past. So the event in the past is the part that is the third conditional, right? Doesn't really matter what color it is, it's just coded so it's easier to see. But then the second conditional part is the present characteristic. It's the thing that is following us at the moment. That is the second conditional. And I can't highlight it because my laptop's being quite annoying today. There you go. So, as you can see, this type of third conditional is actually fine because I'm saying that if I hadn't done that specific thing in the past that upset you, then you wouldn't have gotten upset. So I'm saying that it's impossible to change this fact of the past that also affected something bad in the past. So if we go back to the third conditional, we said that these are impossibilities because something is too late. And so it also makes sense to use this in the context of the mixed conditional. Something that is present, something that continuously happens in the present, has affected something in the past and made something quite negative. Okay, so let's think of some more examples, shall we? If I were smarter, I would have won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2024, right? That's a nice example. This person is saying that they have major problems with their entire personality, which has created the reason why they didn't win a prize 2 years ago. Okay. This is a really good example. Putting yourself in the situation of another person by saying, if I were you. This is something that's very typical when it comes to the second conditional. What would you do if you were somebody else? If I were you, I would try yoga. If I were you, I would go to the hospital. um what would you do if you were me? These kinds of things. I think that these are all really good examples of second conditionals. But equally, if we say, if I were you, I would have broken up with him years ago, what are we actually saying here? Putting myself in your situation, I, in the past, did something differently. So what are we doing here if we are not giving useless advice to somebody else? It kind of reminds me of what we said in the third conditional when we said, you should have done something, right? Oh, you should have broken up with him ages ago. This is a great example of useless advice because it's like, great, okay, did I break up with him? No, I didn't. So, what do you expect me to do? Right? So, this third conditional and second conditional mix, where we start with the if I were you and then mention what we would have done differently in the past, it's actually a really good example of more useless advice, just like we said in the third conditional when it's on its own. But we're saying that combination of a present characteristic and then how it affects the past. Okay? So, let's think of some more examples. Oh, I've got a message. I'm a new teacher. Ah, thank you very much. Well, we do provide English lessons for students, but I find it very reassuring that a lot of English teachers also appreciate our advice, um, and grammar lessons as well. Grammar is a strange topic. I think that probably most of you would agree, if you are English and you are learning here with me today, that you might even be learning things that you never saw in school yourself. Because I know for a fact that when I was in secondary school, college, university, I never learned any English grammar. That was something that I did not do. Maybe it's just my education experience, but it's definitely not something that I was taught. Only when I started to learn how to become an English teacher, only when I did linguistics, did I realize, like, oh, there's a lot of grammar that most native English people are missing. So if I can be helpful to you too, then that is great. Please continue watching. Don't abandon me. Thank you. Like, as we were. Let's continue. If you were a teacher, what would you have done? So we can imagine that there is a specific situation in the past that has occurred, but we want to ask advice from somebody else to understand what they would have done in that situation. And then we can respond by saying something like, if I were a teacher, I would have given everybody free break, which is what you think you're going to do when you become a teacher, but actually it's not really the case. So, excellent. We have our first example of a mixed conditional. We have our present characteristic that has caused an event in the past. And really, we see it in two different ways. We see it in this if I were you structure and then would have something with the past participle. And we also see it in this if I were more of a certain characteristic and then something would have happened, right? If I were taller, I would have reached the basket when I threw the basketball that one time. Or if I were a little bit shorter, I would have been able to run around the football players just like Messi, right? There is actually a really famous song that goes, I wish I was a little bit taller, which interestingly doesn't follow the subjunctive rule. It says, I wish I was instead of I wish I were. But you can imagine some example sentences or some example structures from that song. Instead of saying, I wish I were a little bit taller, or I wish I was a little bit taller, I would do this, he could say, I wish I was a little bit taller because I would have gotten a girl who only likes tall guys. I don't know, something like that. But that's a past event, and that's a great example of a mixed conditional. So let's waste no more time. Let's talk about that second mixed conditional, where we start with the third and then we finish off with the second. Now, this is a little bit of a strange one because you might be thinking, well, why can't I use the third conditional here? Why can't I use just the second conditional here? Let's have a look at some examples, shall we? So, we already have our example at the top there. If we had woken up on time, we would be on the bus right now. That's a good example. Let's see if we can think of some more. Now, you might notice that these examples have something in common. It's not completely necessary, but it is something that can kind of enhance the fact that we are using the mixed conditional, and it is this term right now. If we had woken up on time, we would be on the bus right now. If I had seen your letter, I would be writing a response at my desk right now. If I had known Eurovision was starting, I would be enjoying it with my partner right now. I don't know if you've noticed as well that even though this is the second conditional, it's more common to see it with would be and a gerund, so a verb with ing at the end. You can use just the second conditional and say would with a verb, but normally that verb is something stative. So, like have, for instance, it might be if I had known she would be at the party, I would have no, that's a really bad example. I would be upset. Now, let's see if we can think of an I would have example. If I had taken the bus, I would have a problem now. Because the bus makes me feel sick, for instance. It's not the best example, and that's why would be is probably the most common manifestation of the mixed conditional, because you want to show that it's something that is continuous. For that reason, you use the conditional perfect continuous, or conditional perfect continuous, conditional continuous. Would be happening. What would be happening right now? In summary, this entire conditional says if something had happened in the past, what would be happening now? Right? So if I had listened to you, I would be enjoying my life on a beach in Miami, right? Whereas the mixed conditional number one says something quite different. It says, if you were more or less of a certain characteristic, or if you were me, what would have changed in the past? It's quite curious, the difference between these two mixed conditionals. Okay? If you were finding that difficult, what is the difference between these two conditional types? Then I think that this is a really good way to think about these two. But especially when it comes to this particular example here, the second mixed conditional, where we start with the third and then follow it up with the second. If something had Oh dear, that's not good. I wonder if you can hear me now. It's a mystery. I can just use sign language. I actually learned some sign language recently. This is family. 2 fingers. This is dad. So this is British Sign Language, by the way. This is, wait, what's mum? Oh no, this is mum. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, you can hear me now. I would have continued with BSL, you know? That would have been quite exhausting for everybody involved. Anyways, I digress. We are back with the conditionals. So, we've talked about the 0, the second, the first, the second, the third. We've talked about mixed conditional 1. We've talked about mixed conditional 2, where we have the second conditional followed by the third conditional in that first example, where we talk about the present affecting the past. And then we have our mixed conditional 2, where we talk about events in the past affecting the present. Okay? So now, for our last 10 minutes of class, for those of you who are listening, of which I hope that there are millions, although I can see that there might be about 2, I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to give you some sentences, and then I'm just going to give a few seconds for those of you who are listening after the fact to think about what the answer could be, and then I'm going to write the answer for you, okay? So remember, I think a really important thing to keep in mind here is that the third conditional is often used to talk about regrets. For the sake of argument for today, we're just going to focus on the 0, first, second, and third, because the mixed conditional is a different beast. However, we will definitely come back to the topic if people desire it to be so. So let's get started. I'm going to write a sentence into the document, and I would like you to guess what you think the conditional structure should be. Okay? So let's get started. I didn't study, so I failed the exam. I should write at the top here. What conditional is this? That's the first thing that you want to do. So for those of you who are just joining, you might be able to see what we are doing here. We have a sentence. I didn't study, so I failed the exam. How could we turn that into a conditional structure? You must ask yourself, has the exam happened? Is it possible to go back in time? Am I talking about a hypothetical situation? Am I talking about something that is very, very likely? Or am I talking about something that is absolutely certain because it is a fact? Okay? All of these possibilities are in front of us. So I'll give you 10, 20 seconds. That's grandma. I do this all the time in my job. I tell my students to shut up and get on with their work, and then I start distracting them instantly as soon as they start to do it. I'm a terrible teacher for that reason. So, okay, I've given you enough time. I didn't study, so I failed the exam. Now, if you are a genius, which I'm certain that you are, you will have immediately noticed that this is something that is impossible to go back in time and change. So, for that reason, we're probably going to use the third conditional here. I think it sounds the best. For that reason, our result will be, if I had studied harder, I would have passed. Equally, if you want to use exactly the same words as in the original sentence, you could say, if I had studied harder, I wouldn't have failed. Or equally, does it have to be harder? If I had studied. Did you study? No. Well, there you go. If I had studied, I wouldn't have failed. Cool. Are you ready for the next one? Let's turn it into a conditional. Da da da. This is a good one. She doesn't have enough money, so she can't buy the dress. Heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. I'll give you about 20 seconds, same as before. If you are watching the recording, skip ahead, obviously. And if you're not skipping ahead because you think I'm going to give you more sign language, you're right. This is Grandad. Only in British Sign Language, though. I don't know what the Americans say. I've got no idea. What if I was lying? You'd have no proof unless you went to the UK. Anyway, right. Time's up. Now, is it too late for the dress to be bought? I would argue that it isn't too late. No? The dress is probably still in the shop. The problem is the lack of money. So I think in this particular case, it's unlikely for us to get the money together in time to buy the dress. So we might say that the second conditional is necessary here. Did you make the second conditional correctly? That is a different question. Okay. If she had enough money, she would buy the dress. That is the second conditional. Now, a lot of my students think, but Emily, that's the third conditional actually, because that had, you can only use had when you talk about the past perfect, just like in the third conditional that we saw earlier. But as you can see, had in the past perfect also has to be followed by a past participle and, well, okay, in this case, and there are a few other things, but a past participle, that's the main thing. But in this particular example, if she had enough money, do we have a past participle afterwards? No, we don't. So we're actually talking about the verb to have here. We're not talking about had done something, but no. This is not the third conditional. We're just conjugating have into the second conditional. But a good way to check is if you can see have with a thing, then it's probably going to be just have, maybe in the second, maybe in the first. But if you see had and you see it with the past participle, then that's a pretty strong indication that it's going to be third conditional or mixed conditional starting with the third. Okay? Shall we do another example, ladies and gentlemen? Yeah, this one's kind of similar to one that we saw before, but we do like to refresh, don't we? We do indeed. Skip ahead if you are watching the recording. If you are thinking that I'm going to give you another bit of British Sign Language in this time of silence, I'm not. I'm just kidding. Sister is this. This is sister in British Sign Language. This is brother. I ain't got none of that. No siblings for me. Heartbreaking. Instead, I just have, if you've been watching, you'll know what that means. We've created an idiolect within this live stream. Okay, he missed his flight because he woke up late. What do we think? Now, is it too late to catch the flight? Yes, because he woke up late. He missed it. So if it's impossible because it's too late, then we know that we're going to use the third conditional here. Okay? For that reason, what should he have not done? If he hadn't woken up late, he wouldn't have missed his flight. Equally, we talked about this before, you could also use the should have structure for the third conditional to connect that idea of feeling a regret for something that you needed to happen. He should have woken up on time. He shouldn't have woken up late. Right? That's a good example. All right. Let's do 2 more examples and then we'll call it a day. It's a little different, isn't it? I'm reading this and I'm thinking some things, you know. Okay, if you're, I already told you to skip ahead, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Emily, like, I want more British Sign Language. You know, you've given me that sweet vocabulary in the gesticular form. That's not a word. I might have made that up. I'll give you another one, but it's not family related. This one is art. I almost poked myself in the eye then. You see that? It doesn't come with a facial expression, but you can, it's like that. History is like this. You know? I'm learning. It's just something I'm doing in my free time. It's just good to know. I could say, my granddad loves art. I actually don't know what love is. I'm just going to assume it's this. Anyway, people get tired without enough sleep. That's a fact, isn't it? That's just a fact of life. So, is it going to be first, second, third? You're all wrong. It's the 0 conditional. Duh. If people don't get enough sleep, they get tired. Present simple tense, present simple tense. Perfect. That's the 0 conditional. It's a fact. And then finally, let's do one more. I'm not you, so I won't apply for that job. This is maths. This is brother. This is maths. I don't know. It's a fun thing to learn, isn't it? This is PE. I feel like I'm trying to start a fight with somebody if I do something like that, but no, that's PE. Anyway, I'm not you, so I won't apply for that job. We discussed this earlier. If I were you, I what? What do you think? I'm not going to do it because I'm not you, but if I were you, I would. I'm not you, so I don't. I'm not going to do it. But if I were you, I would. This is the second conditional. Right? It's a hypothetical situation. Okay? Great. That's everything that I wanted to talk about today. Now, we've talked about the 0, the first, the second, the third conditional. We talked about the mixed conditional. I'm losing my voice, which is a sign from the Lord himself to stop talking. However, if you want more English content and you want to subscribe to our channel and you want to learn more things about the English language, then you should come to our next live. Okay, I'm dying. I can't speak anymore. I don't know why.